Okay, so if you're involved in, getting goods from overseas, or maybe you're just trying to make sense of all the headlines about global trade, you've probably noticed things have felt a bit, well, turbulent since 2020, especially around sourcing from Southeast Asia. And China obviously plays a huge role there. So this deep dive, we're going to try and cut through some of that noise.
Exactly. We're looking at a really interesting analysis today. It digs into the real challenges, but also the opportunities, which is important for businesses trying to navigate sourcing from that whole region right now.
Think of this as like your quick guide,
Yeah.
getting a handle on the big shifts, understanding where things actually stand today, and maybe what we might expect going forward. We promise not to just drown you in data points. We want to pull out what's really essential.
Yeah, and this document gives a great overview, actually, how sourcing from Southeast Asia has evolved. It starts way back, China becoming the world's factory, and brings us right up to today with all the geopolitical complexity we're seeing.
Okay, right. So to really get where we are now, we do need that history. The document kicks off with China opening up. Late 70s, wasn't it? 1978 is mentioned specifically.
That's the year. That was the starting point. But the real shift, becoming the factory of the world, that was more the 1990s. And back then, I mean, let's be honest, the focus was heavily on cost.
Mm.
Super low cost. And the document's pretty frank, saying the quality was, oh, well, you got what you paid for.
Right, yeah. I think many of us remember those early made in China labels and the quality associated with them then. But the analysis points to the turn of the millennium around 2000 as a real shift, a bigger focus on, quality technology.
Oh, absolutely. A significant upgrade. And from that point, the document calls the geopolitical scene a roller coaster,
Right.
which, yeah, that feels about right. It mentions Trump's 2019 initiatives, specifically trying to push companies to move production out of China.
And that immediately got people talking about places like Vietnam, Thailand, India
Hmm.
as the sort of next big alternatives.
They were definitely in the spotlight. And then, boom, COVID hits. And China's near total closure for what, almost 3 years? That just completely upended the cards, as the document says, changed everything for supply chains.
Oh, absolutely. It forced so many companies to really rethink relying so heavily on one place. Suddenly, diversification wasn't just a buzzword.
Exactly. And it felt like everyone was scrambling.
No kidding. And the disruptions, I mean, they haven't really stopped, have they? You had the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, which really starkly highlighted this growing divide, this
Hmm.
idea of geopolitical blocks forming, the West on one side, the China-Russia axis sort of thing on the other.
It's really fascinating, isn't it, how these massive global events directly ripple down to something as basic as where a company decides to get its...
It really does feel like one thing after another. And the document even brings up a specific example for Israel, which I thought was quite telling. They've apparently become less reliant on Turkey, maybe for political reasons or risk reasons, and are sourcing more from India now. Shows how fast things pivot.
It really does. And India's profile is definitely rising in this whole shifting picture. So, okay, with all this global turbulence as the backdrop, what's actually going on inside China right now? The analysis talks about some pretty big internal pressures, real estate problems, domestic demand slowing down.
Right. So they're juggling their own issues. That property market downturn is significant. People maybe aren't spending as much domestically. And yeah, those ongoing tensions with the U.S. are always there in the background.
But here's a really interesting angle the document takes.
Mm,
It argues that because of these internal pressures, China has actually become more of a buyer's market.
a buyer's market. So, like,
Mhm.
more negotiating power for companies looking to buy from there.
That's the idea. A bit like a housing market with lots of sellers and fewer buyers. The buyers tend to get better terms, maybe better prices, more leverage.
Okay, so potentially businesses sourcing from China might find things slightly more favorable for them right now.
That seems to be the argument. The document even gives an example of pretty decent exchange rate, 7.25 yuan to the dollar, suggesting the balance has tipped a bit towards buyers.
Interesting. And what about trade between, say, China and Israel, given everything that's happening geopolitically? Is that still flowing relatively normally?
The document suggests, yeah, for the most part, business continues. But it adds a caveat: you need to watch specific industries and perhaps more broadly, just keep an eye on the general business sentiment. It's not totally uniform and things could shift.
Okay. And what about those other countries, Vietnam, Thailand, the ones that look like potential replacements? Are they really competing with China on sheer scale now?
Well, they're definitely growing, no doubt. And they are benefiting from some production moving out of China. But the document is quite clear. Their overall sourcing volume still much, much smaller than China's. China's scale is just immense. They aren't true competitors in terms of overall capacity, not yet anyway.
Got it. So China's still the giant, even if it's maybe a buyer's market. So how do companies find the right suppliers there now? Does the document get into that?
It does touch on it, mentions the usual suspects, internet searches using those big international B2B platforms. What caught my eye was a note of skepticism, actually, about artificial intelligence, about how effective AI really is for finding new suppliers. The tone was almost like, is it truly living up to the hype?
Huh. That's interesting given how much we hear about AI being the solution for everything in business these days.
Exactly my thought. Instead of just relying on algorithms, the document seems to value the more traditional methods more highly. Things like actually going to trade shows, working with local reps who really know the ground, maybe even setting up your own local company presence.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Sometimes you just can't beat that human connection, that local knowledge.
Seems to be the takeaway here.
So, okay, looking ahead, what kind of future does this analysis paint? Sounds like a mix of potential problems and some things staying the same.
That sums it up well. On the uncertainty side, the document calls them clouds on the horizon. The first big one is this idea that globalization, as we knew it, frictionless and easy. That might be, well, a bit of a joke now, as the document puts it. The world's fragmenting.
You can definitely feel that. It's not as simple as it used to be.
Not at all. Second, there's a lesson learned from Russia, how incredibly difficult and messy it is to quickly pull out of or decouple from countries with authoritarian systems. There are real economic costs. Then you've got China positioning itself more firmly within that non-Western group of nations. That raises worries about potential secondary war restrictions, basically. Sanctions or trade issues hitting businesses just for dealing with China, even indirectly.
Yeah, that's a tricky risk for any global business. Hard to predict, hard to mitigate.
Precisely. And just the bigger picture fear. The world may be splitting into two main power blocks. That always carries the risk of more tension, maybe escalation, and finally, just the baseline risk internal instability somewhere in the region. That's always a possibility.
Okay, wow, that's quite a list of potential challenges. But you mentioned continuities too, factors that are likely to stick around.
Yes, absolutely. And this is crucial. The document really hammers home that China's economy still needs international trade. Badly. It states very clearly the local market is simply not enough for it to grow. Exports are still fundamental for them.
So, despite all the political talk about decoupling or reshoring, China still needs to sell its stuff to the world.
That's the bottom line. And look at it from the other side. Western countries dealing with persistent inflation. Bringing all that manufacturing back home is incredibly difficult, maybe prohibitively expensive. It fuels inflation further. Meanwhile, places like Vietnam and Thailand are benefiting from the shifts that are happening, and their manufacturing bases are getting stronger.
And China itself, its core manufacturing strengths haven't just vanished, right?
Far from it. The document highlights huge progress. Product quality, massively improved, often comparable to Western goods now in many areas. Standardization is getting better too.
That's a world away from the situation in the 90s we discussed.
Totally different landscape. Plus, you've got their accumulated experience, decades of it. Unmatched economies of scale, that dense network of suppliers for components and materials right there. Their capacity to handle enormous orders. Growing automation that offsets some labor cost increases. Excellent logistics and infrastructure ports, rail, roads. And, relative internal political stability, which shouldn't be underestimated.
So it's this really complex mix. You've got these rising geopolitical risks, serious ones, but then you have China's undeniable manufacturing power, plus these other growing hubs like Vietnam and Thailand. It sounds like a massive strategic puzzle for businesses.
That's exactly the dilemma, the core tension the document lays out. And because it is so complex, with forces pulling in different directions, it's understandably cautious about making bold, long-term predictions.
But it does give some kind of near-term forecast, maybe the next 5 years or so.
It does offer a view on that time frame. It suggests that, yes, over the next 5 years, China will likely stay central, a main hub. But, and this is key, we'll also see these other specialized centers continue to develop alongside it. The document uses the phrase, not be ex-China.
Not ex-China, meaning not abandoning China, but adding other locations. diversifying more strategically.
Exactly. A more distributed approach seems likely. Spreading the sourcing geographically, maybe based on specific needs or risk assessments, rather than putting all eggs in one basket or pulling out completely.
A calculated distribution, perhaps.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay. And then just to wrap up, there's this interesting cultural note the document throws in about 2025.
Yeah, it's a nice touch. It mentions that 2025 is the year of the snake in the Chinese zodiac. And the snake, in that tradition, often symbolizes things like wisdom, transformation, and kind of strategic growth, long-term thinking.
Interesting connection. So it leaves you, the listener, thinking, how might that symbolism, wisdom, strategy, transformation, how might that apply to the very real, very complex decisions businesses need to make right now about their supply chains? It suggests it's not just about numbers and logistics anymore, is it? It's about navigating this whole global picture with, well, maybe something.
Strategic wisdom, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a fitting thought to end on, given everything we discussed. Thank you for exploring this deep dive with us.